Well, hello, everyone. Hello, and a very, very warm welcome to you. Thank you so much for joining us here on today's Showing Up Safe Singing Dragon 15th birthday event. It's absolutely wonderful to have you with us here today. I'm so delighted to welcome you to this very, very special event. As I said, Singing Dragon is 15 years old. And to mark this wonderful, wonderful, momentous occasion, we've programmed in a series of 1-hour discussion events when you will get to meet some of our fantastic authors and to find out more about their areas of expertise. We really hope that these events will help to inform your understanding of differing health modalities and to discover how they can not only profoundly change the lives of our patients, but how they can have a major impact on transforming the communities in which we live. We hope that after today's event, you'll come away learning more about yourself, the vital role that you have in the therapeutic process, and also with some eminently practical skills and tips that you can immediately enrich your practice with. We also hope that today's event will spark some cross-disciplinary conversations, and that also it will provide a wonderful opportunity for us to learn from each other. And already in the chat box, I'm seeing that we've got so many people here who come with so many different skills. So hello to Padma from Oxford, who is an acupuncturist and a yoga teacher. We have Kate Sherman from Pittsburgh, who's a shiatsu practitioner and a licensed therapist. And Dorina Patton is an acupuncturist and a craniosacral therapist, a women's health physiotherapist, and a primitive reflex therapist. So we've got so many wonderful people in the room, and thank you so much for joining us today. The main topics of today's discussion will be showing up safe, how yoga and acupuncture can help our trauma patients, and the vital importance of inner work and self-reflection in order to make the most of what we do. Now, on to some introductions. My name is Kevin Durgeon, and I'm an acupuncture practitioner based in South London. I'm also a broadcaster for UK Health Radio, and I present the weekly show Acupuncture for them. So without further ado, let us meet with our fantastic guests today. Dr. Gail Parker is an author, psychologist, educator, and certified yoga teacher and yoga therapist. She is the author of Restorative Yoga for Ethnic and Race-Based Stress and Trauma, and the forthcoming book, Ethnic, Transforming Ethnic and Race-Based Traumatic Stress with Yoga. Now, Dr. Gail Parker's focus is on how to support emotional balance and well-being for those directly and indirectly impacted by ethnic and race-based stress and trauma, and also to offer tools that aid in the processing of stressful experiences and in trauma recovery. A very warm welcome, Dr. Gail Parker. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, I'm just absolutely thrilled. Thank you. I would now like to welcome our next guest. Laurie-Eve Deschamps is an alchemical healer, a mentor, a dream tender, a poetic scholar, and an artist with over 30 years of practice in the field of Chinese medicine. She's the author of Qigong, one of my favorite books, by the way, exploring the spiritual essence of acupuncture points through the changing seasons, The Alchemy of Inner Work, a guide for turning illness and suffering into true health and well-being, and 5 Spirits, alchemic acupuncture for psychological and spiritual healing. One current focus of Laurie's work is the Taoist concept of the Po soul and the doorway these lower souls provide to healing ancestral trauma. A very warm welcome, Laurie-Eve Deschamps.
Thank you so much, Kevin. It's lovely to be here with you and Gail, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
I must say to everybody who is watching today, all of our wonderful participants, you're in for an absolute treat, because these women are masters in their respective fields, and what we're going to discuss today has never been more relevant. So let's kick off our discussion. So I'd like to first start quite broad, and kick off with a discussion of trauma from your different perspectives. So let's start with you, Gail. Could you explain the difference between race-based stress and trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder?
Yes, and I think it's an important distinction to make, because most of us working in these health professions understand a little bit, or some of us quite a bit, about post-traumatic stress disorder. But a neglected area of trauma and stress is based on racial stress and trauma. And now is a particularly important time, because we're seeing that it's interesting, because historically, during global pandemics, xenophobia and racism increase. And we're actually seeing that, and we're living that. And this is a global problem. This is not just a problem that's local to wherever you happen to be. And so what I wanted to do was to share with people that race-based stress and trauma are real. And I'll tell you in a minute how they're different from PTSD. And also just to bring awareness to that fact, that this is a thing that exists and that it's unique. Race-based traumatic stress is considered an injury. It is not considered a psychological disorder. So to treat it as if it's a disorder, as if there's something wrong with you for having the experience you're having, re-traumatizes someone who is experiencing racial stress and trauma. Race-based traumatic stress injury is regarded as, it's caused by an external racial event. Something has happened to you that is race-related, that has caused you emotional pain, that has caused emotional injury. It also happens to be something that people of color, and particularly Black people worldwide, experience in an ongoing, cumulative, recurrent way. It's not a one-time event that happens. It's based on social exclusion, which for human beings, as we know, is one of the most painful, emotionally painful experiences that we can have. We're hardwired for connection, not for disconnection. So when you are put to the margins, when you are excluded, when you are ignored, when you are minimized, when you are rendered invisible, this is an extremely emotionally painful, damaging experience. And over time, it can become post-traumatic stress disorder. But it doesn't start there. So post-traumatic stress disorder is a psychiatric disorder. It is usually based on, this is the definition, this is the clinical definition that I'm giving you. It's based on usually a life-threatening event that the person has not been able to digest or process. And so they continue having this reemergence of the trauma, because it isn't being digested. It's not being internalized and alchemized in a way that can make it healing for you. So the difference, the core stressor in post-traumatic stress disorder is a life-threatening event. The core stressor in race-based traumatic stress is an emotional injury that's based on a racial experience. And so who decides what that is? The person who's having the experience. It's not up to us to decide, well, that really didn't happen to you. I was listening to, someone was offering a book talk on the book that I have written about this. And a young teacher began to talk, and she said, I think I made a mistake. One of my students, a tall, big, young man, the teacher was white, this kid was Black, was acting out in class. And so she took him outside to talk to him. And when one of the security guards passed them by, the security guard said to her, "Are you okay?" And this kid looked at her and said, "See, that's what I've been trying to tell you." In other words, he felt the insult. He experienced that as an insult. She said that she felt terrible because she made a mistake by explaining to him, well, it was because you were acting out, not because you're Black. And she realized in this conversation that she had made a mistake. So that's a good thing, because what she said is, "I won't do that again." So do you want more? Should I keep talking about this?
Well, actually, as you were talking, Gail, Laurie was feeling it. So I'd now like to come to Laurie. How does what Dr. Gail Parker's, how does what she's just been saying connect with your understanding and the concept of the po-soul?
Oh, well, first of all, I just want to appreciate what Dr. Parker has said. I'm just hearing that clarity of breakdown and distinctions is so, so helpful. And of course, I've read some of the cases from your book, Gail, but this particular story I had never heard you share. And it's just incredibly moving, really moving, and so amazing that we can learn, that we all can learn, but especially as a white person, to say, yeah, we are going to make mistakes. We can't know what it's like to live in an other than white skin. Being Jewish, I have my own heritages of trauma, but again, at this point, I live in a privileged skin, and so we can't know. We have to be willing to admit that we're making a mistake, to learn, to really feel into. So that's a beautiful story, and thank you for sharing that. As far as taking it back to my work, which there is a large focus on trauma, healing from trauma, working with the neurological and sort of emotional, psychological, spiritual effects of trauma. So it's not specifically race-based or ethnic-based trauma. I want to just say, and this is actually coming out of Gail's book, but where you would once again make such a great clarification, race-based trauma as opposed to other trauma, the difference is not physiology, but context. And, that's so helpful to understand, because as you said, in race-based trauma, you're living in a context of, having to move through predominantly white spaces, and the traumas and the microaggressions are considered normal by white culture. So like you said, to begin to say, no, I'm not crazy. The culture needs to change. But staying with that idea that the difference is not one of physiology, but of context. What I want to say is, through my studies of Chinese medicine, what I have discovered is that Chinese physicians, ancient physicians, 3,000 years ago, maybe even more, I would say, if we look at some of the classics, we can say we're going back even more, possibly than 3,000 years, were already seeing the effects of trauma. So, and they described it through the lens of the medicine, Kevin, that you and I practice, and many people in the audience practice Chinese medicine. But again, it's a filter. We're looking at the same neurological, physiological, endocrine changes. Our organisms have not, on that level, fundamentally changed. So what the Chinese saw, and I think it's, again, they were looking through the lens of their own consciousness, which is what we could call a mythical, magical consciousness, a very symbolic medicine that at first may seem quite different, but actually I always say Western medicine and Western science is now catching up with Chinese medicine. And I'll mention that later when we look at the field of epigenetics, but backing up. So the Chinese, what they saw was that when a person experienced that kind of undigestible external event, either whether it's an invasion or a boundary violation by a family member, a tremendous climactic events, cultural upheavals, there's all sorts of ways that our organisms are subjected to events that we just can't metabolize. It's too much to bear. It's outside the norm of my experience or what my body knows should be. For example, a family member who should be protective, who rather is abusive or invasive. We can't metabolize that. We're not meant to. So our organisms have created an amazing capacity to do something with that. And in Western psychology, they'll call it dissociate. We put it aside. In Western psychology, again, they'll say it goes into the unconscious. What the Chinese said is that when we experience this kind of traumatic event, a part of me, which they call the Shen or the spirit, a part of my spirit actually leaves. It's meant to rest in my heart. But when I experience trauma, and most of us have experienced some kind of traumatic event, and it's like a shock to your heart. That shock to the heart is actually, in our medicine, a leaving, a spark of our spirit, what we call the Shen spirit, our light goes back up to the stars where it's safe.
Mm-hmm.
And another part of us, which they call the Po soul, which is, as you mentioned, Kevin, one of my big areas of interest now, which is the body soul, actually takes the memory, takes the material, and kind of puts it in the body below the level of conscious awareness. Again, Western psychology would say it goes into the body, goes into, what does that mean? Goes into the body. It goes into the more primal aspects of the brain and nervous system, what's called the reptilian brain, the limbic system. But in Chinese medicine, we say it goes to the Po soul, this body soul that actually will hold it, kind of encrust it or put it down under the earth. Meanwhile, the Shen spirits, our light spirit, has gone to the stars. So you see often a kind of blankness, a kind of confusion state. People have a hard time talking about what happened. And these aspects of the soul, from a Chinese medical perspective, will kind of hold that configuration, which takes a large toll on the body, on our essences. It's not the holding pattern that is most conducive to life, but it allows us to survive until we create conditions, whether it's in a therapeutic situation, a restorative yoga pose.
So moving on from what you were saying, Laurie Deshar, let's now turn to you, Gail, and find out what is it about yoga that makes it so effective at supporting communities that are living with trauma?
Well, yoga is it's a healing practice. It's a transformative practice. So in the West, it has become, at least in the United States, it has become a physical practice, a practice of physical exercise. But yoga is so much more than that. And when I was introduced to yoga, which was 50 years ago, it was not introduced as a form of physical exercise. It was a holistic practice that spoke to the physical body, to the energy body, to the mental emotional body, to the intuitive wisdom body, and to the spiritual body. The bliss body is what the yogis call it. And so it was a complete practice. And so that was my introduction to yoga. So I never isolated the physical practice from all of that. Restorative yoga is a very specific, so I'm going to talk about restorative yoga. I think all yoga can be restorative and can be transformative, but all yoga is not restorative yoga. Restorative yoga is a very specific form of yoga that uses props to support the body in holding postures for extended periods of time. It's done in silence for the most part, although some people like to play music, but it's done in silence. It's done in stillness, and the entire practice, while it's being supported by bolsters and blankets and creating all just comfort in the physical body. So there's no stretching, there's no muscle energy being used at all. You're trying to reduce stress. Not that there's anything wrong with some amounts of stress, but that's not what restorative yoga is doing. So it's stimulating the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the part of our nervous system that allows us to rest and allows us to feel safe in our resting. When people are under chronic stress, which race-based traumatic stress injury can be tends to be a chronic stressor, resting does not feel safe. When your nervous system is on high alert, whether you know it or not, when it's on high alert most of the time, it doesn't feel comfortable to come to rest. It sounds like it should, but when you are in fight flight mode most of the time, whether you know it or not, that's your comfort zone. That's where you feel safest. It's not healthy though, and that becomes problematic. And so these restorative practices support people who are not used to feeling comfortable in their own vulnerability, who are not used to feeling comfortable in and safe during rest, in getting the rest, the restoration, the growth that they deserve, the reparation and the repair and the growth that they deserve. So that's how this particular practice can support individuals make up the community. So when we used to be practicing together in studios, and now we're practicing together online, so the community, it's a different configuration of community. Community is not a location, it's not a place. It's a group of people who come together with a common interest, who are supporting each other in being healthy, in achieving their goals, in coming to a deeper level of understanding and communion, connection with each other. So that's what the restorative practice does. That's what it supports. And so that's why I like it. And anybody can do it. See, you don't have to, anyone can do it. Anybody can do restorative yoga. One of the poses, for those of you who may not know restorative yoga, is you lay on your back, you put a lovely blanket roll under your knees, you put a nice pillow under your head, you can support your arms by laying on more blankets that you have, and you breathe. And you breathe and you breathe and you evoke the relaxation response. So let me just say that physiologically, the relaxation response is a real thing. When it takes about 20 minutes in the practice for that to click in, your heart rate slows, metabolism slows, brain waves slow, breath becomes more efficient, and there you are. That's where the healing occurs.
Thank you, Gail. That was beautiful. As talking about this community, I always believe that these virtual events, there is something tangible and something real about it, because we're all pouring in our energy into the same focus. Laurie, you were nodding again as Gail was talking. How does acupuncture support an individual? And also, how does acupuncture support communities dealing with trauma?
Well, again, I mean, I'm just taking in some of what Gail shared, and I feel like the key thing, I mean, first of all, just listening and just hearing about that restorative pose, I start to feel my nervous system calm down. It's so miraculous. But that's exactly where I had sort of in my closing to say we need to create the conditions of safety, showing up safe, where the Shen, this speck of spirit, can actually come back to the heart. I often talk about the Shen as these little birds, and the heart is their nest. And when trauma or big emotions come, you know, the trees are shaking and there's storm winds, these little birds fly off, which they do. So we're looking to create conditions of safety, conditions of holding, where these birds can come back to their nest in the heart, and where this material that has been held in the Po can be metabolized. Lying down on the treatment table when you have good rapport with your practitioner is the beginning of a healing process. I know it myself, when even after 35 years of practice and being treated by many people, when I lie down on the treatment table with a practitioner I trust, that same relaxation process already begins. Then in addition, there are treatments, we are not obviously going to go into them here, but there are treatments specifically aimed at clearing trauma, even very deep trauma, through the various meridians and organs where it's held. Again, people in the audience may know some of these. And then there's the use of spirit points, which is a lot of what my book with Singing Dragon is about. And I think of a spirit point as like it's an open gateway into the mysteries. This is the way, and many of these points tell us, use this point for trauma. Heart 7, Shen Men, what's the name telling us? This is the gateway that the spirit can come back through. So at the end, we'll give a couple of points, but again, this is in the book, it's in Kigo. You can read about them and incorporate them, even if you're not a practitioner. You can use these points with flower essences, with oil, simply with touch, and they will open the gateways for these spirits to return. As far as community work, there are amazing community acupuncture clinics doing incredible work in inner cities. In places, there's Acupuncturists Without Borders doing ear acupuncture in all over the world. That is one of the ways that Chinese medicine can function in this work. But for me, I believe that a large part of the healing happens in the treatment room, but it also happens in community. So actually, my husband, Benjamin Fox, and I have started an online community called the Inner Healing Circle at anewpossibility.com, which we'd love everyone to check out. And it really is a virtual healing community for practitioners and patients looking to do this work. And we've got meetups and courses and amazing faculty. I think one of our teachers, Lindsay Fauntleroy, is with us today. So shout out to Lindsay. And it's a growing, vibrant community of healing.
Thank you. Thank you. And again, so needed at this time in the world's evolution. Laurie, you mentioned just then the concept of showing up safe. Now, this is something that I would very much like to return to you, Dr. Gail Parker, to explain what this means and why it is important for therapists dealing with trauma to show up safe to their practices?
So showing up safe is not just important to dealing with trauma. Showing up safe is important to being in connection with human beings, your most intimate partner, to a stranger on the street. So what does that mean, showing up safe? It means that I, each individual within the community, needs to cultivate an inner awareness of their own calmness, their own sense of peacefulness, their own sense of being a safe person to be around. In other words, none of us wants to be the hot stove that nobody wants to touch, do we? And yet, we can be that if we're not being mindful, if we're not paying attention. And so for me, that is a practice, just showing up safe. It involves modulating your voice. For example, I don't want to do the cosmetic stuff, but it does have to do with modulating your voice, the way you approach people, even your physical appearance, just paying attention to how the energy that you're communicating when you're in relationship to other people is the beginning of doing that. But you have to engage in inner practices to do that. You have to be safe, in other words. So if you go to Lori, for example, for an acupuncture treatment, and she is agitated and upset, you will feel that. If you come to me for a psychotherapeutic intervention or even a yoga therapeutic intervention, and I'm agitated, you will feel that, whether I'm aware of it or not. And so each of us has a responsibility to come to that place of inner peace and calm before we go out into the world, because our energy, we co-regulate each other's nervous systems. We just do. So if you're dealing with, so when people come to you for treatment, usually they're anxious. I mean, people aren't usually coming in thrilled to be there, at least not initially. And so it's critically important for us to be grounded in that sense of inner peace, that sense of authenticity, a willingness on our own to be vulnerable, because we're asking you to be vulnerable. And this is how we begin to cultivate and build a sense of trust. And it's the nervous system that is responding. It doesn't matter what I'm, well, it sort of matters what I'm saying. You know what I mean? That matters. But what we're speaking to is the nervous system. So if my nervous system is bent out of shape, then that's going to be communicated to the individual that I'm approaching. And so then I'm not showing up safe. So creating, we hear a lot about creating safe space. Mm-hmm. So we learn, you learn, I guess, how to do, I don't know how, I don't teach that, how to create a safe space. But so I know some people do, and there are all these rules and regulations about how to do that. If you aren't safe, if you are not grounded and centered in your own sense of inner peace and safety and calm and love, heart-centered, you're not safe. You just aren't. So that's
Thank you.
What I mean.
Thank you. Beautifully put. Beautifully put. Laurie, how does this resonate with your understandings and your philosophy on the importance of doing inner work?
Well, I think that Gail has articulated so much about that already. And again, I love hearing you speak, Gail. It's just so moving and beautiful and true. And I love what you said about, well, I don't exactly create safe space, and you don't have to, because you are safe space. You be safe space. And that is the work. And how do we become safe space? Mm-hmm. And then through that create that environment, that's through the inner work. So again, what Gail said about we're transmitting, of course, content, what I say, how I use language, my care with the language is part of the creation of a safe environment. But even beyond that is what's happening at the level of the nervous system. So that is the post-soul, again, the body soul. The body soul is reading so much data that the conscious mind couldn't possibly be taking in. So the environment, the body language, my capacity to come to my own calm through inner practice. And then also what's being transmitted through the heart, which again is a kind of practice. That agitation, Gail, that you spoke about from a Chinese perspective would be saying that the heart is filled with emotion. It's filled with agitated emotions. What happens then? Those little birds are like, well, there's no room for me in the nest. There's no room for the spirit, the light of the Shen, to actually guide what happens in the treatment room. I need to have practices that I do regularly, kind of housekeeping practices, where I clear those agitated emotions, where I have ways to actually clear the heart space so that my spirit can reside there, so I can create the kind of environment. And this is both mythic, symbolic, but it's literal. And as I said, Western medicine's catching up with Chinese medicine now, because they can now measure the oscillations and vibrations of the heart, that it's now known we're affecting each other. Definitely 18 inches, which is, the mother baby distance, measurable to 5 feet. But Kevin, you and I are doing it right now. And Gail, you and I are doing it as I'm looking at your eyes through this screen. We're creating these Shen currents that are affecting our hearts and our bodies right now. So that's my response to that question. Inner work. And of course, our lead in line on our website is inner work leads to outer change. This work that we do with our own nervous systems, with our own hearts, for me is the first step in making change on the planet.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you.
Can I say something, Kevin?
Now,
can I say something?
You can.
Yes.
Go ahead.
So I am a fan of Lori. No, I love listening to you, Lori. I love listening to you. And as I've said to you before, if I were if I lived near you, I would come and be your client. I would. I mean, it's sort of that, where you just kind of, I don't know, you meet and make this connection, and it when how do you know? It's a felt sense. It's a felt sense. Yeah.
Yes. So. And that is through the inner cultivation. That's the basis of yoga. It's the basis of Chinese medicine. It's the basis of all what I call the alchemical practices. Yeah.
Now, we've got another 5 minutes for our discussion before we move on to our questions and answers. You mentioned, Gail, earlier on about laying your patient supported with blankets and helping them to relax. Could you give us your favorite practical tips that our participants here can take away with them?
Yeah, as far as showing up safe, I'll give showing up safe, if that's acceptable. So one of the things that I do, I'll share my practice with you, is what I'll do. So I'm very intentional in making sure that I do no harm. Now, I'm sure that nobody's running a perfect game, nobody. So I'm sure that there are times when I cause harm. I'm not talking about patients, I'm talking about the people in general. I don't just do this in my work. I am living what I'm talking about. So, but I'm really intentional about it. I'm really, really intentional about it and conscious of it. I'm very mindful of the language that I use and of the tone of voice that I speak and of showing up really authentically and speaking the truth. And one of the rules I follow is it necessary? Is it truthful? Is it kind? And does it improve on the silence? You know what I mean? So, and finally, I would say I remain grounded in myself. I know who I am. And so I'm able to create really clear boundary so that I'm not being invasive. Lori talked about how, you know, when people trust you, you have a responsibility to maintain your sense of you so that you are not, you know, invading their space and just invading their space. So those are the things that I do. I'm mindful, I'm intentional, and I find balance and am grounded. So.
Thank you, Gail. Thank you. Now, Laurie, could you please give some practical tips for all of our participants who are here today?
Well, let's see, in 2 minutes or less, I'm going to just two favorites. One is what I call the pause practice. I just did it after that incoming phone call. I had to do the pause practice. So the pause, and I'm going to give the acronym just so people can kind of get it. I use the acronym RSVP, you know, the French Répondez, s'il vous plaît. So how do we respond? So the pause practice, the R is you recognize you're triggered. The S is you stop. In Chinese medicine, we say wu wei, you do by not doing, you stop. The V is a little cheat on the acronym. It stands for reverse. So you reverse awareness and you say, how am I? You know, how am I doing? You care about yourself. And then P, you just get present. Mm-hmm. So recognize, stop, reverse awareness, get present. And through that pause, the heart can speak. Okay, and so that's one tool. Oh gosh, the other one is to recognize that sometimes there are what the Chinese would call ghosts that actually need to be tended from our ancestry. That's a real thing. We don't think about ghosts the way they did, but we think about psychological complexes. So I'm a big fan of letter writing to our ancestors as a form of healing process. And that's a big topic, but I wanted to mention it. If you feel like there's someone in your lineage that you're carrying something of theirs, you can write them a letter and give that over and do some kind of a healing ceremony, because of course, in Chinese culture, that's a very big piece of the healing process. And last but not least, I want to talk about our favorite healing point, and it's in Kigo, the Palace of Weariness. This is everybody's friend. Right at the center of your palm, a loose fist where your middle finger falls. This is your heart protector point. And you can touch it with rose oil or rescue remedy, and it will have an immediate effect of calming our little red birds so they can come back into the heart space.
Beautiful, beautiful. So much for that. This is one of my favorite points of my body. Thank you so much for sharing that. It is now time for us to open up the floor to our wonderful participants and to hear some of their questions. So I'm going to try my very, very best to answer them all. We've currently got 5 questions in. We will answer them as we go along. So let us start with an anonymous attendee has asked this question for you, Gail. Are there restorative yoga practices beyond the physical poses that can be effective for treating race-based traumatic stress? I'm wondering if there are techniques that can be borrowed for other modalities if props aren't available.
Well, yes, I have become an expert, by the way, in teaching restorative yoga without props. I mean, you don't have to have them, but meditation is a very calming, healing practice. It takes, again, about 20 minutes for the mind to come to stillness. When the mind comes to rest, when the mind comes to stillness, the body is at rest, and stress releases when that occurs. And sometimes there's more mind chatter. So people will say, well, I'm really not meditating, but it's not true. It is stress releasing, and it can come through in the form of mind chatter. It can come through in the form of an unexpected emotion. You might burst into laughter. You might, I call it the spirit of folly that visiting us. You might become angry. You might burst into tears. But it's important to recognize that what's happening is stress is releasing. And the practice is, whether you're doing a restorative yoga practice or a meditation practice or any other healing modality, the practice is to be able to remain in the experience while the release is occurring. In other words, instead of becoming reactive and jumping out of it, you learn to stay in it. And then the stress releases. And guess what? Once that happens, it doesn't come back. It really doesn't. It may come back in a lesser form at another time, but whatever you're releasing in that way, when the nervous system lets go, or when the heart opens to receive, it doesn't, that's the healing. That's what happens. So yes, there are a lot of ways. Restorative yoga is one way. That is just one way, and it happens to be my go-to. But again, meditation is another way. I'm sure acupuncture is another way. I don't want to speak out of school here because I'm not an acupuncturist, nor have I ever experienced acupuncture. But I mean, there are a lot of ways to release stress. And it's not yet. Let me say this: people are not coming to me usually to say, and now I'd like to get rid of race-based stress and trauma. That is not typically that is not usually what motivates people to come. But what happens as you become more, as healing occurs, then these awarenesses of trauma that you may not have even remembered begin to surface. And now you can continue the healing process. You can do it through journaling. Therapeutic journaling is a very powerful tool. So
thank you so much. Now I'm aware that we've got currently 5 unanswered questions, and we've got 10 minutes left before the end of today's webinar rather. So please just be mindful of that. Now we've got a question here from Constina Olsen-Howley to both of you. Thanks to Dr. Parker and Laurie Deshar for your knowledge and wisdom. What tips can you give to people who are triggered in the moment to reset and recenter, to stay within the body and in the moment? I find that as a woman of color, there are moments of microaggression that trigger me and shifts my energy, and it takes me a moment to reset. I would love your suggestions. So let's hear from you first, Laurie, and then we'll come to you, Gail.
Well, actually, I'd love to hear from Gail on this one first, and then I'll chime in. Yeah.
Well, if we stick within the yoga paradigm, but we don't have to. Yoga is a breath practice. It doesn't matter what form of yoga you're practicing. And so you always come to the breath. Always. It's when you feel yourself being triggered, if you can catch it before you explode, and even after you've exploded, if you've done that, you come to your breath. And that's the way. That really is the way. You RSVP.
Yeah, exactly. No, I'm totally with you on that, Gail. And that is why having some kind of inner cultivation practice, whether it's yoga or whether it's some kind of sitting practice that you do, and it doesn't have to be, long hours on a cushion. Honestly, it can be 5 or 10 minutes a day of watching your breath then it's in you already. And it's like you have a muscle. So the trigger happens, you go to the breath. I totally agree with that. And to that, I would add one of my go-tos is Bach Flower Remedy Rescue Remedy, Bach Flower Essences. It's a little, I actually have one right here. And I don't have stock in the company, but it's a great product that you can get in most health food stores. It's international. It's in England. It's in all over. And it's made from flowers that will calm you down. They bring the little birds of the Shen back to the heart. You can take it under your tongue or drop it on that point that I mentioned, Palace of Weariness. And there are other points in Kigo too, that if you're interested in specific points, but something physical, something with the breath, and then these flower allies are really another helpful hint.
Thank you so much. We've got 3 more questions and 6 minutes. I need to press my palace of weariness together, I think, in all the excitement. So let's go to a question from Darina Patton. Hi, Laurie, do you believe birth trauma can affect the soul in this way, affecting attachment?
Wow. In 2 minutes or 1 minute or less. That is a huge question. Yes, I believe that birth trauma affects the soul. Yes, it can affect attachment. And yes, it can be healed. It's such a big question. We would need to know when it happened, how old the person is, but I would definitely say finding a really good acupuncturist who works on the soul and spirit level would be a good place to start. And we do have a listing of practitioners on our website, anewpossibility.com. So that's a place. And also you can send a query there. So it's just a very big question, but I do believe it. And I do believe that you can work with it.
Thank you, Laurie. Now we have a question here from Caroline Phipps Urch. There's a small amount of evidence around trauma changing cells and therefore being passed down through generations. Do you have any experience of this with your clients? Who feels like they'd like to answer this?
I would jump in and then I'd love to hear, Gail, what you would say, but I don't believe it's changing cells. It's actually an epigenetic change on the gene code. It doesn't change the gene code. It's like trauma leaves these, what I think of as little sticky notes. They're little tags that get placed on the genes that shut down or turn on certain kinds of genetic memory. So it does get passed down. And you can think of it like our ancestors leave us these sticky notes. And that's part of the work of healing trauma, is actually reading what's on the sticky note and then taking the sticky note away, if you want to think of it that way. And that's, again, the Chinese knew this. They knew that trauma was passed through generations and they would work with it ritually. And now neuroscience and modern science is actually able to identify the changes that are happening there.
And what the yogis say is that when we do our own healing, we're healing the 7 generations behind us and the 7 generations ahead of us. And so that's why it's so important for each of us to do our own individual healing work. And we do it in community also.
Beautiful, absolutely beautiful. Our final question. I'm interested in hearing more about creating boundaries in the treatment room, specifically with regards to trauma in a loving and kind way. And we've got a bit or so for this. So let's start with you, Gail.
So how do we create boundaries within the treatment room?
Yes,
That's
creating boundaries in a loving and kind way. How do we create and maintain boundaries?
well, again, I think that we have to start. I always start with self. Am I compassionate and kind and clear within myself? Do I honor my own boundary? When I feel no inside my body, do I honor it or do I overrule it? So I think, again, I just think it has to start with self, with me knowing that I'm me and I'm not you. That's where it starts, really. I'm me, I'm not you. And then we evolve from, well, where empathy comes in then is, well, I'm somewhat like you. And where the spirit comes in is, I'm nothing but you. But we don't start there. So the boundary is, I am me, you are you. We are two souls meeting and connecting and sharing to understand one another. So I think that, I don't know if that's helpful to you. I just think it's knowing your own, you have to know you first. You have to know what you are willing to, I guess, put up with. Yeah.
Laurie, do you have any final words to close today's program?
Well, I do want to just add to what Gail just said. I love the breakdown. And I do want to say that if that question is coming from a practitioner, I have an extensive course on exactly that topic. A heart-based approach to boundaries in the treatment room. So it is at our site at newpossibility.com. And it's, kind of the product of many, many years of work in that arena. So I wanted to just add that piece.
I'd now like to end by saying a very big thank you to our two wonderful guests, Laurie Eve Deshar and Dr. Gail Parker. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us so very generously.